don't happen to have a notebook with you.
A notebook? I don't. Hopefully one of your classmates will.
No. I thought I had my backpack in my car and I didn't.
Somebody else, unless it's just gonna be the three of us. Hopefully somebody else will have something.
No.
go ahead and hop on iClicker so you can get credit for being here. And we'll get started in a second. All right. Well, today, make sure that nobody's on here. Today, we're going to go through the mutualism lecture. And it is my expectation that won't take a whole time. And so we'll use the remainder of the time to hand back the exam and talk about that. We'll talk about what we have left in front of us. Mutualism is obviously a species interaction. So we were supposed to get to it before exam 2, but this isn't the first year that it didn't fit. So think of it kind of as a bridge to community ecology, which is what will be coming up next Tuesday. Quick question, does anybody have a laptop that still plays? Or laptops like passe? My wife has one, but it's about 35 pounds. I don't trust it would actually work. There's a movie I want to play for us about community ecology, about the restoration of Fossil Creek up in northern Arizona. And this classroom doesn't have a DVD player, so I'll keep working on that. It'd be nice to go to all popcorn and movie day after the hard war with Vaca Volterra, which comes to an end today. Today is the end of Vaca Volterra. We have 2, 3, depending on how you count them, scenarios to look at with mutualism and zero growth isochline for the equations. I think it's very intuitive and straightforward, and I'll try to convey that to you so that there's no extra hassle. And then we will move on to whatever we can get to in the remainder of the semester: community ecology, landscape ecology, ecosystem ecology, global ecology, whatever we can fit in. Okay, so mutualism is, like I said, a species interaction, but it's a happy one. I think a lot of us, when we don't think about nature, just kind of assume that everybody is treating everybody nicely. I guess that's how we would like to think our society is, but our society is just a human creation, right? We're talking about nature here, and 2 species interacting with each other, and a very naive idea that there's just those 2. And mutualism is different from exploitation in that there are pluses on both sides. Okay, so there's the potential for everybody to win here. I guess you could define mutualism as just that, a win-win. Both participants, both species are benefiting from the interaction. So we'll look at one really great example, a case study in mutualism to get at the concepts. We'll look at kind of the diversity of mutualistic relationships. And then we'll look at the Vaca-Volterra equations and zero growth isoclines. And then finish off the chapter talking about the evolution of mutualism. Okay, so we'll start here, just like I said, an outline. Types of mutualism, an example, a beautiful, although outdated experimental example, Vaca-Volterra. evolution, mutualism. Okay, so this is the case study. I think we might have actually nodded towards it earlier, talking about these ants. The example comes from this two-party interaction, two-species interaction. It is a butterfly, which you see there on the top, but that's not the participant in the mutualism. The participant in the mutualism is the larvae or the caterpillar who you see on the bottom. And it looks like he's being eaten by ants, doesn't it? He's not being, well, he is being eaten by ants, but only in a good way. And we'll learn about that interaction here in a second. So this is the imperial blue butterfly from Eastern Australia, the larval caterpillar form. The ants in the relationship are from a genus called Iridomyrmex. So you have ants and you have caterpillars. And what people noticed when they first started watching this interaction is that the ants seemed very interested in the caterpillars. People went so far as to say, before it was even studied, they appear to be guarding them. They're all over them. They don't leave them alone. They actually kind of escort them in and out of their nests at the beginning and end of the day. So it really did look like kind of a beautiful relationship where the ants were tending to the caterpillars. But if you're going to be a buzzkill like I will and say that Darwin wouldn't go down with that, and natural selection doesn't really understand things in terms of just doing good deeds, the question becomes, what are the ants getting out of this relationship? And what are the caterpillars getting out of this relationship? Of course, when people started watching these, they didn't know it was a mutualism. So they were probably asking, well, is one of these parties losing? Is this an exploitation? Are the ants eating the caterpillars and thus just acting as grazers or even predators? But that's where getting data and experiments come in handy. So if it's going to be a mutualism, there has to be a positive side for both. And because this is a case study of mutualism, you can go ahead and assume we're going to find benefits to both. This is a mutualistic relationship. If there's no benefit to one of them, we call this a commensalism. In other words, if it's neutral for one, but positive for the other, then that's commensalism. And as we already know, exploitation is where one party benefits and the other party loses. In this particular case, this would be a case of parasitism, because nobody's actually getting lethally, yes, parasitism, low lethality, low number. Okay, so those are the different options. Of course, the other option is that they're competitors, interspecific competitors, but there we would have to show the shared resource that they are fighting for. Okay, so here's what people started to observe is that the ants were very, very protective, very, very diligent tenders to these caterpillars. They would provide them shelter, they would escort them in and out at night. And what it turned out to be the case of is that if the ants didn't do that, things went very badly for the caterpillar. This is a caterpillar that is essentially the walking dead. This is not a caterpillar that's going to emerge into a butterfly. It'll be lucky if it survives through progressive stages. It is a host to a parasitoid wasp. That's what all of these little egg-looking babies are coming out of the caterpillar. They are little baby wasps. So a parasitoid wasp found this guy. He must not have been very well tended. He must have been vulnerable and laid all these eggs inside of this caterpillar. Okay, so parasitoid wasps are pretty big exploiters of many other arthropods. What people also noticed was that the ants were not just escorting these things, but they also seemed to be nibbling on the caterpillars. And so people started to ask the question, is there a chance that the caterpillars are benefiting from the protection of the ants? And is there a chance that the ants are benefiting by actually getting some nutrient or something, some sort of benefit from the caterpillars? This is what was kind of guessed at through natural history observations. And so the question is natural selection favoring a mutualism where the two species actually benefit each other, or a mutualism? And should we think of that as, I mean, obviously a love fest is just a human term, but should we think of it as, how should we think of mutualism? Should we think of it as selection really favoring the two getting along? Or is there some more realistic way to think about mutualisms? Okay, again, I'll be the buzzkill. There's no such thing as selection for a love fest. What most people tend to think of mutualism as is the rare case where both parties simultaneously exploit each other, except because they're both getting something from the other party, they're both benefiting. And so it's not exploitation, it's not asymmetrical, it's actually symmetrical in that they're both simultaneously exploiting each other. But if you are exploiting me and I'm exploiting you, and it works out that we both are in that relationship, then it's a win-win, which is a mutualism, and not a win-lose like an exploitation. So why does it matter to think about that way? You have to remember that selection isn't acting on the relationship. Selection, you know, there's no I, so like, oh, I want there to be more mutualism in the world. I want species to get along. It would be great if there was that, but selection acts on the individual. Fitness goes to the population. There is no big scheme or grand plan for species to get along. And so when they do get along, it's probably wiser to think of that as the almost accidental simultaneous benefit that each gets from the other party. Now that becomes important because then we want to ask about the stability of mutualisms, and could they change from mutualisms to other types of relationships? So both parties, both species, are under natural selection. They want to get, you know, they're not thinking this, but they are being favored. Natural selection is favoring the physiology or the behavior or whatever the trait is that maximizes the benefits while minimizing the costs. We've already mentioned a possible benefit here. Maybe the caterpillar is protected from these wasps, these parasitoid wasps, and maybe the ant is getting something delicious out of this deal. Both of those, so those are the benefits that we'll see if they exist, if they're being maximized. At the same time, you always have to consider, you're nibbling on this thing, okay, that's maybe a benefit, but what are the costs of being in that relationship? And what are the costs of being in this relationship? The benefits seem huge, you don't get riddled with wasp eggs, but is there some, what is the cost-benefit ratio of that relationship? Because that's what natural selection is going to act on. It's going to favor traits that enter into any kind of relationship that have the best cost-benefit ratio, the lowest cost-benefit ratio. Because of this mutual exploitation idea, and I think that's even like usually a quiz question, what did I say is a good way of thinking of mutualism? Love fest, other options. Mutual exploitation is what's going on here. Because mutualism is thought to actually be just mutual exploitation, you oftentimes see mutualism, if you can see it evolutionarily, it dies out. We're going to talk about what makes mutualism stable, but oftentimes you get parasitism after mutualism goes through a period of evolution. So because both parties are in it for themselves, but they happen to be helping each other, you can get an evolutionary tug of war where one species starts winning. In other words, one species starts getting all those benefits and not giving or not incurring the cost of whatever it takes to benefit the other species. Because that's what the selfish party would do. Okay, great that you're getting something good out of me. I'm getting something good out of you, but even better for me, maybe, if I can get even more stuff out of you and I can stop letting you have anything that might be costing me anything. If it's not costing me anything, well, then it's not a mutualism. If it's totally neutral, that's a commensalism. But that's what we expect is the potential for mutualism to descend, or not maybe not descend, that sounds like a negative thing, but evolve into parasitism. Okay, so how do we test for mutualism? We need to find the benefits to both parties. So here, as you can see, some very old looking data. It's almost like it's mimeographed. Naomi Pierce, way back in the around the time I was born. Wait, no, not born. High school. I forgot. I was born before that. I graduated in high school around the time this was done. So this is really, really, really old stuff. Naomi Pierce from Harvard did this amazing experiment. This is still looked at by some people as just a classic and field natural history experimentation. To be able to pull this off in the field is truly remarkable. She wanted to see what's going on here, what's the benefit? And if you want to ask, what are you getting out of this relationship? The obvious experimental thing to do is try to manipulate things so some parties get to be in mutualism and other parties or other individuals are restricted from having that relationship. And then you see who, you know, what are the differences. So she immediately started with trying to create caterpillars that got to be in association with the ants, and then others that could not be in association with those ants. And there you see from two different sites, both in Australia, the dark bars are caterpillars living with ants, and the open bars are those without ants. She was able to do this because there's this cool chemical called tanglefoot, and you can put it around a tree, you can put it in a box, you can put it on the sidewalk, and it essentially makes most arthropods unwilling to cross that barrier. It's a very sticky substance, and they are able to sense it ahead of time. It essentially allows you to eliminate things past that barrier. So she put the tanglefoot barrier on some trees. That meant that ants didn't go up those trees. She was able to establish these are trees with ants. These are trees without ants. Both types of trees have the caterpillars. She then tracked the mortality of the caterpillars. Again, two different sites, different stages, or instars as we call them, and showed in every instar at both sites huge mortality. Let's put it the other way. Huge survivorship gains. If you are with ants, your mortality, it's the average probably there, 10 to 15%. 10 or 15% of caterpillars die if they're in association with ants. That at least doubles. The mortality of these caterpillars is much worse when they are, and you can see there's a side effect, right? Here, you absolutely have to have ants. Here, well, you do about twice as good if you are with ants. Regardless, there's a benefit here. Notice in both of those graphs, although Canberra looks like it has a bigger benefit of having ants, both sites, the larvae or caterpillars are able to survive without ants. Okay, not as well, lower fitness, higher mortality in the white bars, but still, although here everyone dies without ants, still some evidence that the relationship is not absolutely what we'll call obligate. In other words, if you have an obligate relationship, that means you have to have them or you die. Okay, and we're actually going to categorize mutualism as either obligate or what we'll call facultative. Facultative meaning I can take it or leave it. I'm better with it, but I can survive without it. And that's what we see here is a facultative relationship. The caterpillars do better with ants, but they can serve, but they don't go extinct in the absence of ants. Okay. Bullet down there near the bottom reminds you of the bottom-up, top-down difference. This is a top-down benefit, experimentally showing that in the presence of ants, you survive better. And the top-down pressures are those from predation, those from exploitation, those from disturbance, like predation. We will see here in a second an example of a bottom-up benefit, but the benefit to the caterpillar is survival, is not being attacked, not being killed by these parasitoids in the way they are in the absence of ants. Okay, so we have established a top-down benefit to the caterpillars. We now have to ask the question, what about the ants? Is there a benefit to the ants? What are the costs to the ants? Why are the ants tending the larvae? Because we don't believe they're doing it just out of the goodness of their heart. Here are the data on that on the ants. And here's the problem. That was such a beautiful experiment. She then proceeded to say, okay, how can I show the difference between fitness for ants with caterpillars and without caterpillars? The same way she had trees that had ants and no ants, and was able to show a benefit to the trees having the ants. She tried to do the same thing. She was unable to do that because if you remove caterpillars from a tree, and that's got to be a lot of work, like climbing a tree and removing all the caterpillars, the ants leave. Ants refuse, this genus of ants refuses in nature to live in a tree that doesn't have caterpillars. Starting to sound a little bit needy. The ants need the caterpillars more than the caterpillars need the ants. The caterpillars did better with the ants, but they didn't need them. They didn't obligately need the relationship the way it appears that ants need this relationship. Ants leave a tree if there are no caterpillars. So she wasn't able to say ants in this tree with caterpillars do better than ants in this tree without caterpillars because you can't get an ant to live in a tree without a caterpillar. Okay, so what do you do instead? Instead, you get creative. And what she did was she showed, okay, if I want ants, I got to have caterpillars. All the trees have caterpillars. They've got ants. But notice how I can show that at the beginning of the day, when ants are climbing the tree to go see their friends, next slide. Ants going up the tree are the dotted line. The same line of ants coming down the tree later in the day has gained weight. It's gained substantial weight. So here is an example of a bottom-up or resource benefit. The ants appear to be getting some sort of material benefit. And that's what we suspected because we saw them nibbling on them. They weren't eating them, they weren't harming them, but they were taking some sort of nutrient benefit or some sort of water gain. Whatever it is, the ants seem to be doing better with the caterpillars. And as we just went over, it must be a pretty important benefit because they refuse to live in a tree without them. Pierce was able to kind of estimate, you know, for every 62 caterpillars tended, that gets the colony enough biomass to put out another 100 workers. So a bottom-up resource benefit for the ant, a top-down protection benefit for the caterpillar. For both, you have to ask, like, what are the costs of this? Because if the costs start to go up, that's when you would expect natural selection to go enough already with the love fest. We're going to have to, or natural selection is going to start favoring something else. This food benefit seems like a pretty good thing. I don't have any data to present on this, but oftentimes food we know is a little less important than protection. If the ants started being preyed upon by something because they were feeding on these caterpillars, that would be a cost that would obviously start to outweigh any material benefit. I mean, if the caterpillars just, I don't know, had some rare mutation and started putting out some toxin, that wouldn't make a lot of sense if they want to retain the mutualism. But if the ants the caterpillars started being toxic to the ants, that would immediately disband this mutualism. It would no longer be a benefit, but instead a cost to nibbling on them. Think about the costs that could occur over time, especially because these two parties are not doing this for each other. They're doing what natural selection is saying provides the highest fitness. And if natural selection starts saying, for example, to the caterpillars, you know, you'd be a lot better off if you weren't giving whatever it is, this chemical or this sugar or whatever it is. The ants are eating this thing. If that is costing you, natural selection might actually start favoring a trait of giving some other substance or giving no substance. Natural selection starts saying ants, stop giving this benefit. Sorry, natural selection on the caterpillars starts saying this is too costly. Then the ants stop benefiting, and all of a sudden you've lost your mutualism. So we're going to look at a bunch of different diverse examples of mutualism here. I just want you to think in each case, what are the benefits that they're both getting, and how could that change over time, especially losing out for one party? Okay, so not nearly as many people study mutualism as study predation. Predation is just cooler. It's also maybe because mutualism is harder to define. Evolutionarily, it's not very stable. It can change into exploitation. And so the field of ecology has not been able to kind of unify it and say, okay, here's the theory behind mutualism. They're still kind of struggling to understand what mutualism is. I'll say that's changing because of the new field of microbiome studies. The bacteria in the guts of all organisms that appear to be doing good and not bad. Of course, there's plenty of bacteria that do bad things, but the kind of community that lives with bacteria that live within all organisms is relatively unknown. We know it's there. We know they must do things, but people are just starting to learn. When you have that bacteria, this biochemical synthesis goes better. We don't know all of the mutualistic relationships going on inside the microbiome of organisms, but the huge revolution in microbiome studies is starting to change that. Okay, so remember, as we talk about the diversity of these interactions, that there's two big ways to categorize it. Either for you, it's a deal breaker. It's an obligate thing. You must have that other species in this relationship to survive, or it's facultative. It depends, is a way of putting it. It's not necessary for the survival, but you do better. You have higher fitness if you are in that interaction. It's a two species interaction. So by definition, we can have both parties with obligate needs, or we could have both parties take it or leave it, facultative, or we could have an asymmetry where one party absolutely needs it and the other party is more facultative. It's going to matter, especially when we get to Locke of Volterra, because remember how we talked about two species interactions when they are intense, and we've only talked about intensely bad ones, intense competition, intense predation. Whenever it was intense, the two species were not very stable with each other. And it's going to turn out that even when it's a mutualism at play, the intensity of two species interaction is a destabilizing thing. If you've been in a relationship where you just felt a little bit like you needed the other party too much, you usually get broken up with. Two-party interactions are most stable when, yeah, you're in an interaction, but lots of other things are important too. Your carrying capacity, predation that you get from another species. When it's more complex and multivariate, things are stable. When there is an obligate two-party relationship, I cannot live without you, you're dead without them. And that can be very destabilizing. And we'll see that in the Locke of Volterra. Okay, obligate for both, facultative for both, or one and the other. Oh, well, given that, hopefully you can immediately identify that what we had with the ants and butterflies was an asymmetry. We had caterpillars that were facultatively in a relationship with ants. They could take it or leave it, but they did better with it. But ants that were obligate, they would not live in a tree without the benefit of that resource.
What about like the difference, like, okay, they would live there, but could they not survive? Or, you know what I'm saying?
I think, what's just changed? I think it's probably it would require more research. She found that she could not get the ants to be there, leading her to believe that they couldn't exist without each other. I guess that takes a little more experimenting to make sure. If you come in the lab and you still cannot force them together, then maybe there's just something, or you can't force them to live without each other, then maybe that's more evidence that it's truly obligate. So these things are a bit of an estimation, but can they absolutely not live with them? Or is it, so what you're asking, is it truly obligate, or is it just really, really, you want to be in that relationship? And I don't think they know the answer. To the extent they were able to experiment, it was obligate for the ants. Okay. So let's talk about a diversity of examples. We'll go through these kind of quickly, but a lot of them will look familiar. Pollinators. This is mutualism. If you are a hummingbird and you are taking nectar and you are then spreading the seed around, you are in a win-win relationship. It is no surprise that the explosion of flowering plants evolutionarily was followed by an explosion of pollinators, the explosion of insects. Pollination is a really neat example in that there are facultative relationships. There are pollinators that can just get sugar from just about anything and will then spread those seeds around. And then there are, and hummingbirds are an amazing example, there are South American hummingbirds who have a bill shape that is designed, evolved for one type of flower. They're pretty much screwed with any other kind of flower. Presumably they evolved in an area with a lot of these flowers. They can have like a curve to them so that the hummingbird's bill is perfectly curved to get deep into the flower. So there can be really, really strong, almost, we'll call them obligate, although I imagine if all those flowers went away, the hummingbirds would be sticking their curved bill in places that doesn't need a curved bill and still get some sugar. But there are some really strong evolutionary relationships where it appears the pollinator has morphology that's evolved over thousands of years to match exactly the resource that they are getting in the mutualism. Cheaters. Whenever we talk about two species interacting with each other, especially when we're saying that they're both getting good stuff out of it, we have to ask the question of cheaters. In other words, what happens if one of the parties stops giving the benefit to the other, especially if they're able to stop giving the benefit, but can keep getting their own benefit? That obviously becomes an exploitation. So cheaters, a good example of cheater would be, think of a plant that's in a pollination relationship, but it's costly. There's a limit in water. It's energetically expensive to make the sugars that the pollinators, the hummingbird or the bumblebee have come to rely on. Well, one thing that oftentimes happens is that over time, the quality of the nectar goes down and down and down. In other words, it becomes more and more dilute. It's less sugar and more just water, almost like a fake benefit, a much less costly thing for the plant to produce. So we see all the time these mutualisms break down into exploitation, plants that stop giving the true benefit. The only question, the only worry then is, do their mutualistic partners ever figure it out and stop giving them their benefits? That would seem like a pretty risky strategy, to be a plant that stops giving good quality nectar, and then all of a sudden your pollinators just stop coming to you, and then that's going to lead to your death or your extinction. But this is the tug of war that mutualists find themselves in. They're trying to maximize the benefit and minimize the cost of what maximize the benefit of what they get and minimize the cost of what they give, oftentimes leading to asymmetric exploitations. Very similar scenario, fruit dispersal. This is a more generalized thing. There are some fruit eaters that specialize on a certain kind of fruit, but most are kind of omnivorous or frugivorous. They eat all the fruits. And what do they do with all the fruits? They poop the fruits, and the seeds then spread and benefit the plant. So fruit dispersal is similar in that it's as a mutualistic relationship, but it tends to be a little more generalized. You don't have specific pollinators that are specific to a certain kind of plant. You have fruit eaters that will eat any fruit that's available and therefore benefit the plant as well as themselves. Protection, this is one that we've already gone over with the larval caterpillars. There are a lot of mutualisms that on one side of the equation, there's protection. And as we saw in the case study we looked at, it was asymmetric. The caterpillars were getting protection, and what they were giving was a bottom-up resource. These can be pretty specialized. I mean, if there's one species that protects you, that's pretty specialized, and that is a relatively unstable thing. to rely on one species or one genus of ants to be willing to protect you from parasitoid wasps. It's a beneficial thing, but it's a little bit specialized and therefore can become relatively obligate, or if not obligate, it is something that that is subject to the evolutionary tug of war. You could start losing those benefits if that specific type of protector stops protecting you. Mutualism is also, I've already alluded to the microbiome a little bit. There's a lot of mutualism going on within organisms. Ruminants that chew their cud and have a gut flora that is required, that has evolved through a long coevolutionary history. They cannot live without that gut flora. They cannot eat. The only thing that they're adapted to eat, they cannot eat unless they have that gut flora that's going to digest it for them. On the other side, that gut flora is in the perfect place for itself, whether it's chemical levels, whether it's the nutrient that they're getting out of the whole thing. It is an obligate relationship in a lot of the same way that I suggested microbiome relationships are obligate. Termites are another example. Termites could not exist unless they had little buggers in their gut that help them break down wood. They can't do it themselves. It's another species, probably another suite of species that allows termites to do their business. So both of these are really specialized and they're both completely obligate, and therefore they're would be predicted to be unstable, but they've in fact been in association with each other for hundreds of thousands of years. And so that actually makes people wonder, are our models wrong by saying that mutualism should be unstable when we see really, really long-standing stable mutualisms between species? What are we leaving out of the models? Not to the models yet, almost. This is a plant version of kind of the microbiome example. We have trees, many trees in the desert Southwest that could not live here because of poor nutrients, poor soils, but can only do so because of mutualistic relationships. I'm thinking about the Palo Verdes, many of the legumes out that we have on this campus. They could not live in this nitrogen poor soil without a mutualistic relationship with bacteria that live in their root nodules. And that's what you see here. All these little dark bulbs are root nodules where the legume roots are housing in a perfect environment for bacteria, nitrogen fixing bacteria. So the nitrogen fixing bacteria say, I'll live in your roots and I will sequester nitrogen, limiting nitrogen for you to live and to grow. And so obviously the plant benefits from that, especially in a nitrogen limited environment like the desert, and the bacteria gets a perfect place to live. This is a facultative relationship in that the plants could live without it, but not nearly as well. And so this gets to your point a little bit, it's facultative, okay, but what if we change the planet to be completely nitrogen limited? Does it then become obligate? Is it then like the plant could not survive or grow at all or reproduce if it didn't have nitrogen fixing bacteria? Right now, this is a facultative relationship. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually an obligate relationship for the bacteria because only in these root nodules can they find proper, do they get the biochemistry that they need to live? Cleaners are fun. It's a pretty general one. Certainly, there aren't too many birds that will only pick flies out of one species' nose. So it can be prone to cheating. It can also be prone to commensalism. I mean, the question is a bird picking flies out of your nose giving you a substantial benefit? If those flies are going to lead to disease and kill you, then yes. But is it possible that this could actually be a commensalism where the bird gets the flies out of your nose? The bird gets kind of a nice feeding place, and you pretty much just put up with someone sticking their bill in your nose. So this is a general relationship. It's pretty facultative. No reason to believe that anybody is going to go extinct here because of the loss of the relationship. And that actually makes these types of mutualisms more stable. All right, well, there's your friend. Locke-Volterra. And the final lecture on Locke-Volterra, I think, is a really simple one. You remember competition, right? This is the competition equation. You need to do one thing and one thing only to make it the mutualism, and that is draw a line right there. So your competition coefficient used to be minus alpha 1, 2, N2 for species 1, or minus alpha 2, 1, and 1 for species 2, and I think we have that on the next slide. We don't. I lied, but you know that it exists for the growth of species 1 and the growth of species 2. You could draw this equation for species 2. To do so, you would need to just switch the alpha from alpha 1, 2 to alpha 2, 1. But to switch it to mutualism, you need to change it to a good thing and not a bad thing. Minus alpha was sucking off population growth dependent on the intensity of the competition and the number of the interspecific competitors. Now we're going to add population growth based on the number of the other species, because now they're a good thing for you. And the alpha is now kind of a mutualism coefficient. A bigger alpha means you get more out of them, and a low alpha means you get less out of them. A bigger alpha with a big N means more population growth. A lower alpha with lower numbers of the other species means you get less population growth. And R and N and K are all the same thing as before from logistic growth. Got to do this for both species. Here it is for the other species. Now the benefit to species 2 is how good is species 1 on species 2's population growth multiplied by the number of those the other species that you benefit from to some extent. Okay, so the same, so that's just Locke-Volterra logistic growth with Locke-Volterra competition, switching the minus to a plus to make it a mutualism equation. We're gonna draw zero growth isoclines for them now, and it's going to be very important whether or not that relationship is facultative or obligate. Again, facultative means you need the relationship for the population to persist. In other words, species 1 must have species 2 for species 1 to have population growth or to exist, and species 2 must have some of species 1 to persist. Okay, so remember the competition, we always put species 1 on the X and species 2 on the Y. We have a zero growth isocline for species 1's growth at 0. And first thing to note is that species 1's zero growth isocline actually intersects the Y-axis at a very important place. This place where species 1's zero growth isocline enters the Y-axis is a place some minimum number of the other species. This is species 1's zero growth isocline. So this is a minimum number of species 2 for species 1 to exist. This is an obligate dual relationship. So remember, you used to have a threshold number of the carrying capacity, a threshold number beyond which species 1, K1, was a number where beyond it, species 1 could not grow. But now we're talking about the other species being a good thing. So we're now saying for species 1, there's a minimum number of species 2 that you've got to get to, above which the mutualism, an obligate mutualism, favors the population growth of species 1. So everything above species 1's ZGI is actually population growth. Everything below it is population decline. Down here, there's some combination of not enough species 2 relative to species 1. I mean, things are really bad out here. There's a lot of species 1 and not enough of species 2. You're never gonna, if it's an obligate relationship where species 1 needs species 2, it's not gonna work. You can get more and more species 2, and you start getting close to a place where even a lot of species 1 can grow, but only if you have this many species one, you need a lot of species two for species one to be growing. Okay, so the most important thing in obligate relationship with the zero growth isoclines is where does the ZGI intersect the other species axis? You could change the angle of this, and we will in a second to see the intensity of the relationship and how that matters. But that's the ZGI for species one. We'll do the same thing for species two. Species two now has a minimum number of species one for species two to exist. Why? Because it's an obligate mutualism. Now we're looking at species two, and it grows by going up. If you have more than this number of species one, you have population growth for species two. Let's do a little problem solver. Right here, we have gone past the minimum number of species one, and yet right here, species two is growing. But let's go here. Here, I'm past the minimum number, but I have grown so that I have so many species two here that the relative numbers do not lead to growth. So this is the minimum number, but as species two gets more abundant here, you need more and more of species one to allow species two to keep growing. As more of species two are added, that's going up, more and more of species one are needed to supply them. Again, it's an obligate mutualistic relationship, and therefore they are highly dependent on each other. That shows up when we look at the stability and the dynamics. So we're putting both ZGIs together. Again, species one, you're going to have to draw these probably. Species one ZGI has got to intersect. If it's an obligate mutualism, species one's ZGI has to intersect species two axis. Species two's ZGI has to intersect species one's axis. That's the only way to draw an obligate mutualistic relationship. It gives us three zones. The zone where there's a lot of species two and not much species one. That's good for species one, but not species two. Say that again. If there's a lot of species a lot of species two, immediately in an obligate mutualism, if I tell you there's a lot of species two, you're going to say that's good for species one. And that's why species one is growing this. But when there's a lot up here, when there's a lot of species two, but there's not enough species one, that's bad for species two. That's why it's declining there. Vice versa here. Species one is declining because there's not enough species two. It needs its partner. Species two is growing here. Why? Because there's a crap ton of species one. A and C zones have an asymmetry. We can live with that. The truly depressing thing is the middle zone. And again, I'll go back to those needy college relationships. If you need the other one so bad, things never end well. Both parties are declining in this middle zone. The middle zone used to be the place we could find stability, but not if it's an obligate relationship. That means that if there's like roughly the same number of each species, that's not good enough. I mean, that's what this a line to the origin would be, right? Is for the addition of every species one, you add a species two. That is not good enough for stability. That leads to extinction of both species. In a strong obligate relationship, each species cannot exist without the other unless the other is really abundant, as we saw in those two zones. Intense species interactions, even if they are win-win, lead to instability. And that's a little bit counterintuitive, but it allows us to remember these are simplistic two species models. And when you've only got two species interacting, they need to have a buffer. A refuge from predation, carrying capacity mattering more than alpha, or simply let it be facultative instead of obligate. That's what leads to this instability. In the middle zone, both species decline to extinction. Okay, so that's not very stable. That's a very unstable. Dual obligate relationships theoretically are very unstable. This is the same graph, except changing the slope of these two lines so that they cross, because we always want to see what happens when the lines cross. How do you get the lines to cross? You change the slope. Conceptually, what you've done here is you've lowered the intensity. In other words, it takes fewer of the other species to keep the other species at zero growth. It's still an obligate mutualism, as you see from the title. You still have intersection with the other axis, but you don't have to get as much of the other species to get you going, to keep you going. That offers graphically this little honey spot here, a place where they both have zero growth, which in the past has been a place that there's the possibility for two species equilibrium. And there is the possibility of that, but we have to ask the question whether it's a stable equilibrium, and it's not, as we've shown by the open circle. And you can tell it's not a stable equilibrium because the dynamics do not always point towards the cross. The dynamics here and here suggest you could move towards this middle, but the dynamics here are extinction for both, and the dynamics up here are population growth for both. So it's not a stable equilibrium. It is a more stable relationship because it's less neediness. You don't need each other as badly, and it offers this one slight hope. If you can get a lot of both species, and maybe this is how some of the more intense mutualistic obligate relationships persist. If you can have plenty of gut flora and plenty of hosts, then both species can grow. But as soon as it becomes asymmetrical, one or the other is losing. And if you go into this bottom zone, both species decline. Okay, so we have so far looked at the obligate mutualism CGIs, two versions, one with a strong slope. Well, I guess the slope depends on what you're looking at. One where they cross and one where they don't. Both of them were pretty unstable. This one's more stable than the other one because of this happy zone up here. The other and the last zero growth isocline that you need to learn for this class, probably forever, is the dual facultative relationship. Hopefully you can see the big difference. Just looking at species one now, but look what's happening differently. There's a K. Species one's zero growth isocline is intersecting its own axis. That means there's a place where species two does not exist. You've lost the other species, your mutualistic partner, that species one can still persist just at its own carrying capacity. Okay, so your question is, what's the difference between drawing obligate and facultative mutualisms? The difference is, where does the line intersect? For an obligate relationship, species one's ZGI has to cross this axis. For a facultative relationship, you need to show there's a place that species one could exist in the absence of species two, and that's the definition of a facultative relationship. Of course, you can move it along there as K differs, and you can change the slope to show the different intensity of a relationship. But generally, a facultative mutualism, you got to have that K. You got to have a place where species one exists in the absence of species two. Above it, you've gone past your K, and you decline, below it, above it, you have enough of the other species relative to your own numbers for population species one to have population growth. When we add species two to that, we again have three zones, but things look a little better now. You still have the asymmetry, species two growing over here, where it's got a ton of its partner. I mean, out here, you know species one is declining. It's way past its carrying capacity, and you haven't given it enough of the other species for it to grow. Same up there, species two is declining because it's way past its carrying capacity, and the other species is not abundant enough. But the big difference is that now the middle zone is a happy place. Now, one-to-one relationships lead to population growth for both species. So there is a possible zone of intermediate coexistence. And this fits our idea that facultative mutualisms are more stable for the two species than our obligate relationships. Okay, so summarizing mutualism, the less intense it is, the more likely it is for species to coexist, for sustainable coexistence. This is not how the real world seems to work. Maybe it's just because we notice obligate mutualisms more, but there's a lot of examples of highly interdependent, specific obligate mutualisms that continue to go on. This could be that our models are too simple. I don't know if you noticed, but in the obligate relationship, there was no K. So that's purely for simplicity's sake. When you're in an obligate relationship, it's almost certain that you do have your own K. It's just that the models are trying to emphasize the other species is really important. And so you don't include K in the simple model. But that's an example of being too simplistic. Maybe if you add complexity to some of these models, you'll start seeing how obligate relationships can be sustainable. And all through the whole thing, we've got to remember that and all of these species interactions are a tug of war. Natural selection over a lot of time is putting a lot of pressure on each party to put out the most adaptive phenotype and genotype. So there's, in other words, the take-home message here is that things are probably constantly changing. And that's going to be the emphasis of the last few slides here, is actually looking at the evolution of mutualism, and actually seeing that there's a lot of evidence that it does turn into parasitism. So maybe it's true that mutualism is unstable and oftentimes ends as parasitism. If we think about it as not altruism or anybody trying to do anything out of the good of their own heart, but instead mutual exploitation, then we would expect that tug of war to result in some winners and some losers. And that's what exploitation or parasitism is a winner and a loser. Returning to the case study example, this is the family of butterflies that we were looking at before. About half of the butterflies species in that family have an association with these ants. About half of that half have a win-win relationship, like we saw in the example, where the butterfly gets something from the ant and the ant gets something from the butterfly. The other half of the half that have a relationship with ants show a parasitic relationship. So these parties that appear to often be in relationship with each other sometimes have a win-win and sometimes have exploitation. If you look at it phylogenetically, there's a lot of mutualism in this phylogenetic tree. And what Naomi Pierce found was that very often in different lineages, mutualism in the blue props up into parasitism. And that when you get parasitism, you never get more species. That actually parasitism is a bit of an evolutionary dead end. Mutualism, I mean, look at blue. Blue is just getting more and more blue. There's a lots of speciation going on from the mutualistic ancestor. And then they split off for other reasons into different branches, and you get, two mutualists for one parasite. Lots of mutualism, but where you get exploitation, you rarely see species evolving from that. In other words, the species goes extinct. Again, natural selection is not trying to keep biodiversity. Natural selection is going along its path, and sometimes the path goes to true exploitation, and that doesn't always end well for the species. So it looks phylogenetically like mutualism oftentimes turns into exploitation, the way of the world. Okay, mutualism is a lot of different things. To the extent that the models weaken the interaction, it stabilizes mutualism. When it is highly specialized and dual, it's thought to be unstable, but we have lots of relationships like that still out there. When you look more closely at it, you oftentimes see mutualism turning into exploitation. All right, that's everything for mutualism. That covers our level of ecology and species interactions, interspecific competition, all of the different forms of exploitation, and then mutualism. I mentioned commensalism, which is not one that we really talked about, because there's even less work on commensalism than there is on mutualism. Okay, so we've got 10 or 15 minutes left. I'm going to hand back exam 2. There were 2 A's, there was a B, there were a couple of C's, and there were a disturbing number of D's and below. You can see your score when I give it back to you, and on Canvas, you can see your current state in the course. For some of you, those numbers are a little troubling. On the bright side, most of the people struggling are here and are fighting the good fight. And that means that they're going to get a nice chunk of those 100 points that come from iClicker participation or just attendance. Feel free to remind me if it looks like that got calculated wrong. That said, I don't want anybody to think that it's just going to be a cakewalk because those points are there. I mean, you can go ahead and do the math and say, all right, what if I get all 100 of these? Does that bring my 53% in the class anywhere near the score I need to get a C and count it towards graduation? You can do that math and you can come do it with me if you want to make sure that we're on the same page. Also recall that there's the option to write a final paper, and that would make your grade out of 1,000 instead of 850. Obviously more work, but it may be that some of you, especially those of you here and are fighting for this, you may be better in written format than you do on test format. That said, a lot of people really suffered on the short answer, which suggests to me that that may not be the case. So you have to decide for yourself, is writing the paper going to substantially help you? And I can help you make that decision, help you pick a topic that sounds like it will be fruitful. I can help you with all those things. But it's easier for me to help now than it will be when the exam is 3 days away. What else did I want to say about it? The short answer was really not good. And that troubles me because I'd rather you be able to talk about an ecological issue in different ways, individual population, and think about it. I mean, that's more important to me than whether or not you remember, whether or not allele effects are stabilizing or destabilizing. And so to that effect, I'm going to make the next Canvas participation thing a very similar assignment, where I either pick something, and I'll put details on Canvas here in the next few days. It's going to allow you to look at an ecological issue from multiple levels and talk about the different levels and show how they are interactive. I'm going to make that worth 30 points. Well, it's worth 20 points, but I'm going to make you're going to be able to get 30 points out of it. So if you kind of look at this and go, okay, what does he think I'm not doing enough of here? Ooh, I talked about individual ecology, but I never mentioned natural selection. I never mentioned the phenotype. I never mentioned plasticity. I never mentioned the things, thermoregulation. A lot of people said behavior, and then they just stopped at that. He thinks if I could talk more about this, I'd be showing how a studied individual ecology matters. You can look at that, and then you can improve it on the next Canvas participation thing. Then there are 10, what essentially are bonus points, extra credit points that are available to you if you do a really amazing job on that. Okay, so that's one thing I want to do. I will also go ahead and say that if you are willing to make an appointment with me and talk about this, then I will make you eligible to replace this score with your exam 3 score. Okay. That's huge for some of you, because for some of you, this shouldn't have happened. I don't know if you were distracted or what, or you don't like math or something. But if you could replace this with even, 20 or 30 points more, it would change the world for a lot of you. That does require that you email with me and we sit down. Okay. Happy to do that with all of you. For many of you, that's not going to help a lot because you got like 90 or 95% on this, but you're welcome to sit down with me too and be eligible for that. If you don't do better on exam 3, nothing will change. I won't hurt your grade, but if you want to help your grade by replacing the score with exam 3, then you're eligible for that if you have a meeting with me. It has to be on Zoom. It can be on Zoom, although usually would be more productive in person. Let's say, actually, and I'll put all this on Canvas, that you need to at least make that appointment in the next 7 days, because I don't want to be having appointments with people in final exam week just so they can get eligibility. I want to talk to you now about where you feel like I'm not helping you enough and where you're not, like I'm studying 6 hours a day and this is happening. We need to figure out what's going on to the best that we can. So get in touch with me in the next week if you want to be eligible for that. I don't think I can remember anything else to say. Oh, one reminder that the final exam is only worth on, it's not a final exam, it's exam 3, but I call it final exam because there is material, some cumulative material. The details from exam 1 and exam 2 are probably things that you don't want to forget, but you don't want to spend your time reviewing. It's going to be big things like levels of ecology, big conceptual things that you'll want to still have in your brain for exam 3, but then obviously a focus on the new material as well. So there's even more reason to give you credit for doing better on exam 3 than exam 2, is that some of the big picture questions might reappear on exam 3. Okay, I got to notice that our exam is right here. Sometimes they make you move rooms, or right here. Can't remember the date, but that's going to make a big difference for a lot of you. Are there any questions about those logistics before I hand back your exams? And yeah.
So overall, you would say that exam 3 is going to be better for us grade-wise than exam 2?
Well, I can't make that promise. Obviously, it could be worse.
Okay.
In my experience, exam 2 is a shocker, right? It's so quantitative. Even though I try to make it like, conceptually, how does this happen? I mean, there were some people that was like, page by page, I was like, oh my God, there's 2, none wrong, 2 wrong, none wrong, 2 wrong. And then I got to the last 2 pages and it was like 25 wrong. There was a breakdown in the ability to think bigger picture. So in that respect, I'm worried because I don't think it is just about the graph. There were some other people that completely just threw the final page of drawing stuff. Even though you were able to draw that on a worksheet, some people just didn't draw. They didn't draw predator-prey graphs. The whole page was regarding the lock of Volterra DGIs for predator-prey dynamics. And some people drew the only competition graphs. And that puts me in a difficult position. How do I give you any points when you don't even know the graphs that you're drawing are about competition and not predation? So there were some big errors like that. A lot of that will not be there because exam 3 will be about mutualism, but there will be some drawing, some graphs there. So I can't really answer your question. It will be better if you make it better. But there's even more motivation to make it better now because it could make this go away. And by replace, I mean, if you got a 40% on exam 2 and you get an 80% on exam 3, then you get an 80% on exam 3 and you get an 80% on exam 2. Huge, right? Okay. I mean, for people that really, really have a hard day. Yeah. Yes. 1. But same thing. You can maybe write a new one with some mutualism stuff on there, or maybe you want to make it be more. You might want it to be more conceptual. Whatever you think would help you with that one sheet and that one sheet only. Okay. So remember, want to be eligible for that, we got a, email is the best way to reach me, canvas me, I'll get it in my email, but then I have to go to Canvas. But get in touch soon and we'll have that conversation. I don't bite. And then you'll be off and running and hopefully spend a lot of your energy making sure exam 3 is a big improvement. Okay, I'll hang out. Well, I'll hang out for 5 minutes. If you do see things you want to talk about, we can. But even better if you take some time to look at it and then come to me with all of the questions that you have rather than, you know. Yeah. Great. You want to talk? Otherwise, I'll see you on Tuesday for community ecology.